Their trump card, pun intended, was to get this man back in the White House. Because if they get this man back in the White House, they can split the support for Ukraine. And look at the people who praised Trump immediately. One of them was Viktor Orban of Hungary, an ally of Vladimir Putin within the EU, who also wants to break support for Ukraine. So I'm Professor Scott Lucas. I am Professor of U.S. Politics at the Clinton Institute, University College, Dublin.
So I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president.
What I'm processing this morning after Donald Trump's victory in the presidential election, and as we await the outcome of the congressional elections, is this is not normal. And every proper journalist, every proper activist, every responsible person should start with this is not normal. And I need to explain why I say that. For the first time in U.S. history, a convicted felon will be president of the United States. Not only will this man be a convicted felon, he, having been convicted on 34 felony counts, faces about another 50 felony counts in 3 other cases. This is a man who was found guilty in a civil case of defamation related to a serious sexual assault, which a judge said was tantamount to rape. This is a man whose business, the business that he used to propel his career upon, was found guilty of widespread fraud and imposed with one of the heaviest fines in New York State history. This is a man whose charity was disbanded because of fraudulent behavior. This is a man who has insulted women, Hispanics, blacks, the military, the disabled. This is a man who has said that from day one, he will act like a dictator and he will use the military against enemies within. This is a man whose own staff, whose own White House chief of staff and head of military said he is, their words, not mine, a fascist. This is a man who, less than 4 years after launching a coup attempt that failed, has gotten back into the White House legally this time. This is not normal. Why do I say that to the media? Because there are going to be all kinds of efforts today to treat this in terms of normal by dissecting this. By dissecting this in terms of what did the Harris campaign do wrong? What did the Trump campaign do so right? By looking at certain groups of voters, but often in a very superficial way. So, for example, you're going to hear the media today talk on and on about how the priority for many voters was the economy. True. But how many folks in the media, instead of talking about perceptions of the economy in these past weeks, drilled down to talk about the reality of the economy? How many media outlets noted that the rise in inflation to 9% in 2022 was due to a post-COVID shock with constriction of supply chains and the Biden administration's attempt to pull the U.S. out of recession? And how many of those outlets, if they did note that, would now note that the inflation rate is 2.4%? How many of them would have noted, for example, that U.S. unemployment is at its lowest rate since the 1960s, or that GDP is 3.5%, which would make the UK envious? How many of them would have actually not just said Kamala Harris made a speech about economic policies, but actually gone into those economic policies and what they would have meant, as well as the Biden administration's Infrastructure Act, its CHIPS Technology Act, its Build Back Better, Inflation Reduction Act for a green economy? How many of them did that? And conversely, how many of them actually tested Trump's economic policies or lack of economic policies? Instead of going for the easy line, people don't feel that well off. They're angry, they're resentful. Or to give you a second example, and we could deploy many, how many in the media would have, when they recited Trump's line that millions of migrants are crossing the southern border, how many would have then noted that the undocumented immigration across the Mexico border this year is down 77%? 77. How many of them would have noted that when the border security measure, the most sweeping border security measure in decades in the US, between Republicans and Democrats, supported by Kamala Harris and the Biden administration, was sabotaged by one person, Donald Trump. Maybe a few, maybe they can hold their hands up, but I'm certainly not hearing it today. Why is that important? Look, Donald Trump, people are angry. People are resentful. People are fearful. The United States is in a quarter century of trauma from 9/11 up to the present. I can give you a whole chain of events. And they're still in a cycle of fear and resentment after the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. And what does Donald Trump do? He exploits that anger and resentment. He simply says, I can wish it all away. And doing so, he gets a headline, he gets a soundbite, and he doesn't get tested. I'm going to get challenged on this. First, we're going to get the YouTube comments of whiny liberals, whiny this, whiny that. Well, you call me whatever I want. That is simply the analysis of what's happening here. And it's not just blame the media, it's blaming a damaged American political culture. Because what does this mean? I mean, what does this mean going forward? I mean, if you want to talk about domestic issues, right? What does it mean for domestic issues? Look, if you look at Donald Trump's track record on the economy in the first term, it was not a further surge beyond the Obama years. It was an unprecedented explosion in American debt, and we can talk about the effects of it. It was a chaotic approach to tariffs. It was a chaotic approach to allies over economic matters. But what happens this time around is that the chaos is accelerated because is it a 10% tariff on everybody, a 20%, a 30%? Is it a tariff tax of 60%, 75%, 100% on China? Is it, as Trump said recently, a 20,000% tariff on automobiles, foreign automobiles? You know, if you watch his interview with the Economic Club of Chicago recently, when he was challenged on tariffs, he can't respond. He has no capability to respond, and then says, "Oh, you economists, you always get everything wrong." If he's asked what's going to happen to interest rates, which were supposed to come down early next year, and the effects of his policies, he won't be able to answer. But his advisors are planning to politicize the Federal Reserve. Why? Because Trump doesn't like the Federal Reserve taking independent decisions that might not necessarily reflect well on him. So we get the threat to politicize the Federal Reserve, to politicize the Treasury. On immigration, we're going to get a return to ideas such as we'll make Mexico pay for it. Here you go. You're not going to be able to do that. We're going to build the wall. That's not going to quite work either. And what we're going to get is, instead of a practical way to achieve border security, because Trump sabotaged that, is simply stigmatizing not only migrants, but asylum seekers and refugees, and threatening to deport millions of them. That's where we are. And if we were to talk about this in terms of policy after policy, what Project 2025 says is the reality of it is they're going to take control of the agencies. They're going to take control of the agencies to co-opt them to Trump's will. And we should just be clear about that. You may support that. You may call it draining the swamp, but that's what happens. And you may get the prospect that rather than adults in the room, you get Elon Musk coming in being some type of technology guru for Elon Musk ego, and you get Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a conspiracy theorist, especially about COVID-19, having a role in healthcare. That is where we are. And on foreign policy, as we affect the UK, let's be real here. Trump will threaten to pull out of NATO. He did so before, he'll do so again. But even if he doesn't pull the US out of NATO, he will limit America's, or try to limit America's role in NATO. He'll try to pull it off to the side. Trump will bail out on Ukraine. He will support his friend Vladimir Putin, having been turned by Putin in 2017 in a conversation at the G20 summit in Germany, to effectively support Russia's annexation of more than 25% of Ukraine. The EU, other European countries, other countries in Asia, international community will continue to try to support Ukraine, but with the US on the sidelines, we're probably going to move to a situation where Ukraine is going to be partitioned between most of the country that still stands and the part that's under Russian occupation, a West Germany, East Germany scenario in 2024. On the Middle East, Donald Trump will, and he said this, sometimes the truth comes out amidst the deceptions. Donald Trump will give full support, unconditional support to another one of his friends, Benjamin Netanyahu. Doing so, this means that Benjamin Netanyahu will have no checks, certainly not from the United States, on that ongoing war on Gaza and possibly on Lebanon. Of course, the Biden administration could rightly be criticized for its policy. I criticized it, but at least the Biden administration was trying to do something behind the scenes to limit the war. That doesn't happen now. Indeed, what will happen beyond that war will be kind of a chaos in foreign policy where countries will scramble to flatter Trump. The Saudis will flatter Trump, as they did in 2017. The UAE will flatter Trump, as they did in 2017. The Saudis in the UAE will have further leverage on Trump because they have financial stakes in businesses involving Trump's family, including his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. They will try to exploit that leverage. China will try to exploit the leverage that even as Trump threatens tariffs on him by trying to flatter him so that he at least tries to express admiration for Xi Jinping. And yes, North Korea will flatter him again. This, in other words, will not be a U.S. foreign policy, not for alliances, not for the UK, not for Europe. This will not even be a U.S. foreign policy for the U.S. This will be a U.S. foreign policy for Trump's transactional approach, what makes Donald Trump look good. So where do we go from all of this? Look, the American system should not be challenged as it was in 2020 by a man named Donald Trump who attempted to overthrow it, carry out the coup. It should be respected. The votes of people should be respected, both for president and for what may be a Republican Congress or a split Congress. But at the same time, we need to be clear-eyed and clear-headed about how that vote came about. Because the U.S. political system, damaged and traumatized since 9/11, could further be damaged by the snake oil salesman who seeks to exploit it. And those people who think that he will come to save them and make America great again will be part of the fodder that he will use. And clear-eyed, moving forward, whether in the US, in the UK, in Ireland, where I am, that's the only way we're going to deal with a situation which is one of the most dangerous that I've faced in my lifetime.
And I say Putin would not have gone into Ukraine if that didn't happen.
The Russians in 2016, of course, interfered in the campaign by collaborating with the Trump campaign. I mean, that collaboration, which they tried to bury, is in the Mueller report, is in the Senate Intelligence Committee report. Now, this time, the Russians did not need to be so blatant in terms of stealing emails and feeding them to the Trump campaign. They could put out their propaganda. They could put out their PR, which they did incessantly. They may have been a little bit heavy-handed in trying to send bomb threats to voting booths and polling stations in Georgia. But beyond that, the point here is the Russians didn't need to have cooperation with the Trump campaign this time. All they need to do was to get into social media, was to get into other outlets for information and feed the narratives that we've been talking about, the narratives of fear, the narratives of anger, the narratives of division. The Russians didn't need to do more than that because they had allies this time. They had an ally in particular named Elon Musk, who knew exactly what he was doing when he was actually carrying out the same type of information warfare that the Russians do. So yeah, the Kremlin will be celebrating because the Kremlin's priority right now is they had been bogged down for 32 months in Ukraine. They had begun to make advances in the east, but they were still relatively gradual. There were questions about how long they could sustain that effort. Their trump card, pun intended, was to get this man back in the White House. Because if they get this man back in the White House, they can split the support for Ukraine. And look at the people who praised Trump immediately. One of them was Viktor Orban of Hungary, an ally of Vladimir Putin within the EU, who also wants to break support for Ukraine.
No other path. There was no other path to victory. We also have won the popular vote. That was great. Very proud of that.
I mean, there was the flutter earlier this year when Trump says this will be the last election you have to vote in, and then oh no, you misunderstood me. I'm not trying to be an autocrat here. Uh, Trump is a wannabe autocrat. I mean, that's the first thing we need to say. Now, can he succeed at being an autocrat? I think even as Trump tries to break the American system, there's probably certain red lines that can't be crossed. And to extend the two-term limit, he'd have to have the support of both houses of Congress and then take it to the states, get a three-quarters majority. And I think, even devout Trumpists don't necessarily want to have him have perpetual unrestricted power. So no, that's not the threat here. The threat here is how much damage he can do in the next 4 years. I mean, and when we say how much damage he can do around 4 years, it's not just him, it's that inner circle around him. Some of whom were there in the first term, some of whom will be new faces, but all bent on the fact that they want to consolidate power for themselves. They do not want the system of checks and balances to get in their way.
Ja. Die dort Verantwortung tragen. Und das werden wir auch so weitermachen. Unsere Hoffnung ist,
there's a form of politeness in international relations, and so he's won, so it's fine. He's won, and you acknowledge that, and so on. As I said, some powers will do more than congratulate him; they'll manipulate him from the get go, and that is the way that this works. I think, just as I'm saying, we need to be clear eyed and clear headed about where the U.S. is going. We need to be clear eyed and clear headed in terms of where other countries go or where they choose to go. And the fact is, you can't depend on a Trump administration. I'm I'm not sure you could depend on the U.S. in some ways, for quite a long time, at least in the idea that the U.S. leads and we follow. But you now need to be very, very serious in terms of the fact that when it comes to your security, when it comes to your defense arrangements, when it comes to your economic policy, you know, you aren't necessarily going to be able to have a positive relationship, especially a multilateral relationship. So you've got to build relationships elsewhere. But here, since we're talking about the UK, here's the irony. The UK has cut itself off. It cut itself off from a major relationship in 2016 because of Brexit. Now it has the option not of getting back into the EU, that's rolled out, but either bending to Trump's will, because you have to bend to Trump's will, or trying to go it alone in many ways. Uh, and it is doing so at a time when there are other wannabe Trumps, and we need to be clear eyed about that. Viktor Orban in Hungary is a wannabe autocrat. Uh, Arguably, the far right in Germany wannabe autocrats. Marine Le Pen in Germany, in France, wannabe autocrats. Something that Trump's chief strategist Steve Bannon has been trying to exploit for years. So, there are various places you could talk about. You could talk about the relationship with the UN. You could talk about the relationship with NATO. Absolutely have to talk about that. You can talk about your relationship working with allies when it comes to an issue such as Ukraine or such as climate change, which is going to be vital as well. And that's where you have to go. You have to be the adults in the room when you cannot count on the fact there will be adults in the room on the other side of the Atlantic.